We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 25th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, South Korea's president is in Washington after a stop in Tokyo. What's at stake in his meeting with Trump, and could Japan's political shake-up slow the momentum? Then,
I believe you have two willing parties, and usually that's good news, but two willing parties that want to make a deal.
Despite Donald Trump talking up his peacemaker credentials, there's still no sign of a Putin-Zelensky summit. We'll look at what it really takes to make a deal and why Moscow says it's nowhere near ready. We'll have a roundup of the front pages and ask why so many art galleries in the US are closing. Then we'll examine New Zealand's decision to suspend postal deliveries to the US. Plus,
a lot of Syrian cities have what's called a corniche, which is this promenade or sort of boulevard along the coastline.
We'll hear how Syrians are once again enjoying trips to the seaside. We'll have a roundup of transport news, and finally we'll explore fashion's new little luxury. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli strikes hit the Yemeni capital Sana'a on Sunday in retaliation for Houthi missiles fired towards Israel. A Houthi health official says the attack killed 6 people and wounded 86 more. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday he backed Ukraine's calls for robust security guarantees as part of any peace deal. And Chinese property giant Evergrande's shares were taken off the Hong Kong stock market today after more than a decade and a half of trading. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung is cramming a lot into this week. He's meeting President Trump in Washington today after a weekend stop in Tokyo to try and reset ties with Japan. All of this is happening while US and South Korean troops are running joint drills, which North Korea really isn't happy about. Well, to unpack this, I'm joined by Robert E. Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Busan National University. Robert, thanks for coming on the show. Hope your children are safely locked up today. President Lee's only been in office for 2 months, and now he is face-to-face with Trump. What are the top issues on the table, especially when it comes to the alliance and, of course, the nuclear threat from the north?
Sure. I think the biggest issue actually is not going to be security. I think it's probably going to be trade. And that's because South Korea and the U.S. have in place, technically, legally, a trade deal going back to 2018 and before that, 2011. And that treaty has been ratified by both legislatures, and it provides a pretty rich structure at 1,100 pages long for the trade relationship. And Trump has just thrown that out the window. He's just stepped around it and starts demanding a deal, and he wants, sort of South Korean investments, and, he wants to slap tariffs on. All that is formally illegal, right? I mean, it's really black letter law. And so I think probably the biggest thing the South Koreans want, since the United States is their biggest export destination, is some kind of framework or regularity or structure or something from Trump besides some vague deal. And that's, of course, what the previous trade treaty was supposed to provide. But, there's now a lot of confusion. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, after that, are these security issues.
Yeah, I mean, Seoul's already promised a hefty package of US investments, though. Lee stopped by Hanwha's shipyard in Philadelphia. So what would he want on trade after those earlier tariff deals? And also, how important is it for him to keep US protection against North Korea solid, even as Washington possibly focuses more on China?
Right. So on the trade deal, I mean, honestly, with Trump, it's so tricky to know, right? I mean, he kind of changes his mind about this a lot, which has been something that's really been sort of emphasized a lot here in the South Korean media. My guess is that there's some specific issues that corporations have had with imports and exports into South Korea, particularly in agriculture and in digital services. Apple and Google, for example, want their mapping services to be able to operate more freely here. The South Korean beef market is significantly closed to American farmers, which, is a core constituency for Donald Trump. So I imagine there'll be some of that, and Trump will try to sort of use the leverage of American market access to squeeze out those concessions. I would also imagine that Trump will ask for one of these sort of investment structures or payoffs or something like that, right? And I hate to use the word payoff, but that's kind of what it looks like, right? I mean, it's not actually clear, like, for example, are the Europeans really going to spend, like, all this money in the United States? Now, who's going to direct it? Is Trump going to make these choices? That's how he's talked about, right? I mean, if it looks like a grift or a shakedown or something like that, I imagine that'll go very badly in the South Korean media.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to security, I think the big issue is China, right? The U.S. has an alliance with South Korea that puts it in nuclear jeopardy from North Korea. And so if we're going to do that, if the U.S. is going to stay here, then wants to get something back from South Korea. And the big thing, of course, in Asia, to no one's surprise, is China, assistance with China, particularly Taiwan scenarios. And South Korea has been traditionally kind of wary of getting pulled into that. But, the U.S. doesn't get a whole lot from the alliance with South Korea without that, right? I mean, we get nuclear risk from North Korea, right? And what are the South Koreans sort of paying us back with? And I think that's really what Trump is going to bang away at. Either you guys help us with China or we're going to start to retrench out of Korea.
But in fact, even as he headed to the US, Lee sent a special delegation to Beijing. They were there delivering a message calling for normalized relations with China, which, of course, as we know, have been strained in recent years. So this is surely going to have some kind of a bearing on the talks with Trump.
Yeah, it's tricky. And this is where it gets actually into sort of like partisanship here in South Korea. The South Korean right, South Korean conservatives, and that was the previous president just a few months ago. South Korean conservatives are actually pretty comfortable coming with the United States on China. They're anti-communist. They see China as a big threat. They're anti-North Korean. They want unification. South Korean progressives are much more interested in détente and sort of getting along with North Korea. They don't want to get sort of roped into a big American containment operation in Asia that could take decades, if you compare it to the Cold War, and they're sort of real wary about that. The problem, of course, is that, again, I think, and Trump really has sort of brought this sharply into relief, is that there's really no good national security reason for the United States to stay in South Korea without South Korean assistance on China, right? South Koreans are getting something from us, which is a world-class security guarantee against North Korea, right? And South Korea, the Americans, particularly under Trump, the Americans say, what are you doing for us? And I think the alternative for South Koreans are either to help with China or they pay off Trump. Right. I mean, Trump is the kind of guy who will sort of accept, like some kind of perception that the South Koreans are like paying some kind of, rent or like a payment for U.S. as mercenaries. Trump talked that way the first time he was president. So, and I think that's really where the South Koreans are. They're kind of stuck, right, between these sort of two options, neither of which I think they find palatable.
So this weekend, Lee made Tokyo his first bilateral stop since taking office in June. And he went there before Washington. So that's quite a clear break from tradition. What's the significance of the timing?
Yeah, I think part of that is just, again, sort of the Trump effect. I mean, Donald Trump has really sort of shaken up U.S. allies, right? I mean, 6 months ago, we were talking about whether or not the United States was going to, like, invade Greenland or Canada or something like that, or the Panama Canal. And so if you're South Korea, if you're an exposed U.S. ally, if you're Ukraine, you're looking around for other allies. You're looking around for other friends because the Americans have become radically unreliable in just a very short period of time. It's actually quite remarkable how rapidly this has happened. And so for South Korea, the most obvious option in the region is Japan. North Korea, Russia, and China are all, totalitarian dictatorships with nuclear weapons. They're not obviously good regime choices. And so the Japanese are there. Now, there's sort of traditional issues going back to the war and stuff like that. But again, I mean, if the Americans are questionable, the obvious choice for South Korea to fall back to is Japan. And I think the Japanese are in the same spot, which I think is why you got the the outreach to Japan before the Americans.
Ishiba's party in Japan obviously just suffered this election setback, and his position was looking shaky. There has been a new poll actually today which shows the support for his cabinet has increased by 17 percentage points. But there was a worry that any progress between Japan and South Korea would be short-lived if Ishiba was forced out. Do you think that's off the table now, or will this relationship continue, these two beleaguered countries that need each other regardless of who's in charge?
Yeah, I think beleaguered is a good way to put it. I think the second part of your question is more accurate. To the extent that Japan and South Korea could sort of prosecute their historical grievances against one another, that was, I would argue, an artifact of a thick American alliance relationship. When the Americans were around doing a lot of the big grand strategy, you sort of domestic maximalists could sort of like go all out in the media and stuff like that. But with the Americans out the door or unreliable, which is definitely the case under Donald Trump, right, there's a really strong structural incentive in both, I think, on both sides to cooperate better. Again, because, what else are your alternatives, right? North Korea or, Russia. And so I think that's why, even though you have a progressive president in South Korea, the party that is really insistent on bringing up these old Japan historical issues, I think, he's been quiet. By contrast, if you look at his sort of progressive predecessor, who was in office about 4 or 5 years ago, he was very anti-Japan, and their relationship really crashed. And I think this time around, there's more caution. And again, my guess is that's a Trump effect, because who knows if the Americans are reliable.
And just finally, quickly before we go, the annual Ulchi Freedom Shield drills are underway. Around 21,000 troops. That's South Korea and the US. What's been North Korea's reaction on that?
Yeah, the North Koreans always respond badly to these kinds of things, right? They always sort of argue that these things are a rehearsal for an invasion. That's not really true. So even if the United States wanted to invade North Korea, the South Korean public doesn't want to do that at all. American and South Korean posture here is really engaged around defense. So that's not really accurate. But the North Koreans always say this, and then they always say because of these aggressive exercises, we have to build more nuclear weapons. That was said just a couple days ago. So, the only sort of politically interesting thing is that, again, South Korean progressive presidents have sometimes said, okay, let's not do the exercises as a part of détente or outreach to North Korea to sort of get a summit or a meeting or something. But this time the North Koreans don't want to talk to this progressive president at all. They've been quite clear that they have no interest whatsoever. And I think we're all trying to kind of figure out why. And so if the North Koreans aren't going to talk to us, then we might as well do the exercises.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. That's Robert E. Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Busan National University. And this is The Globalist. It's 12 minutes past 9 in Kyiv, 7:12 here in London. Talk of a summit between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky has flared again, with Donald Trump saying he could bring the two together. But Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, says there are no plans for a meeting and any talks would need a full agenda agreed first. Meanwhile, Trump has been loudly polishing his peacemaker credentials, claiming he's ended 6 or even 7 wars and pushing the idea that he deserves a Nobel Prize. Critics say the record doesn't match the rhetoric. Well, I'm joined now from our Zurich studio by Imeli Isahaho, who is a programme coordinator for peace mediation at ETH Zurich. Imeli, thank you very much for coming back on the show. Before leaders meet, what usually happens in the trenches of diplomacy? Who's at the table? What do they thrash out? And why is that groundwork so vital?
Good morning, Georgina. So indeed, these leader-to-leader summits are absolutely necessary. They carry a lot of symbolic weight. I would say they're not sufficient, however, and it is exactly that background work that's often quite vital. Under normal circumstances, before a high-level summit like this, you would have weeks, if not months, of preparations, not just on the agenda, but also on some of the more detailed options that might be discussed and, in the best of cases, agreed to at the highest political level. However, as we saw, for instance, in Alaska, where the results were relatively thin and light, these meetings can happen a bit more spontaneously as well without that background preparation. So absolutely, meetings at this level are important, but really it is the background work at the technical operational level that often is quite important. The devil is in the detail, and one would hope that if there were such a meeting taking place, place between Zelensky and Putin, proper preparation work would be done. But I wouldn't be too optimistic for such a meeting to take place. If you look at some of the rhetoric coming from Moscow, it looks like they're in no rush to go into a bilateral meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. Sergei Lavrov said all sorts of things. He just did a big interview yesterday. He said that a group of nations, including the United Nations Security Council members, should be guarantors of Ukraine's security. Of course, he wants land too. He says no summit without a detailed agenda. What does all this tell us about Moscow's approach and what the sticking points are?
Well, Russia would, of course, want the UN Security Council to be on board for any security guarantees or any solutions for that matter, because they are one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So it, of course, is in their full interest to do so. A bit more broadly, I think it's quite remarkable what has happened over the past few weeks. There was a Trump ultimatum a few weeks ago vis-a-vis Putin and Russia that we need to make progress, or otherwise we will have tougher sanctions on Russia, including on their trading partners. Now, following the Alaska summit, that doesn't seem to be the case. And also there isn't really a unified Western call for an immediate ceasefire at the moment. So if I were in Moscow, in President Putin's shoes, I would be in no pressure to, again, make progress in the talks. I think they're ready to slow walk and buy themselves time, and they're relatively comfortable with the status quo, unfortunately.
Just picking up on ceasefire, is it essential to stop the shooting before you start talking, or can diplomacy and fighting run in parallel?
So I'll give you a bit of an academic answer in the sense that both are true and both happen. So there are instances where it absolutely makes sense to come to some form of a ceasefire as a precondition, if you will, for political negotiations and create conducive environment for these tough political negotiations to take place. Then you have some other contexts, say particularly in civil wars, where a rebel group might be fighting with the government, and there it is in the interest of the rebel group to hammer out the political negotiations first before silencing their guns, so to say. So again, it's not a black and white answer, but often you do want to have at least some form of a cessation of hostilities as a form of confidence building to show goodwill as you go into political negotiations. But you need that political side. Otherwise, a ceasefire really runs the risk of becoming just a stopgap and not really addressing the political grievances underpinning a conflict.
Now, Trump has made a lot of noise about his role in ending conflicts, even rattling off a list of wars he claims to have settled. I wonder how much of this is about shaping a legacy and headlines, awards and so on, versus any real substance.
As much as I would like to think that's not the case, I do think it is about legacy for President Trump. It is about coming to that quick win and coming to that deal. As you mentioned, he's claimed to have settled, I believe, 7 conflicts by now. But if you look at what's actually happening in those conflicts, not least, for instance, in Eastern DRC, they haven't been fully resolved. So I think for him, perceptions matter more than anything. And the sustainability of these negotiations and deals can be questioned, and actually in some of the instances, if you look at the deals he's come to, they've been only initialed, not even signed by the conflict parties in question. The silver lining, if you want to look at things a bit more optimistically, is that one should try to capitalize on the disruption that President Trump is. He is bringing a new dynamic. He is doing things that were considered unfathomable, weeks, months ago. So one should try to capitalize on these disruptions. But again, that's easier said than done.
And when should the public be brought into peace talks? Is it better to keep everything quiet until there's a deal, or can transparency help?
So I would say you need both. So you do need these confidential safe spaces where you can go beyond political talking points and really get creative without necessarily having agreeing to specific points out in the public at first. So you need that safe space, but at the same time, for an agreement to stick and to stand the test of time, it needs to enjoy broader political buy-in and support. And to do that, you need to make sure that at the negotiating table itself, some kind of more broader set of voices are represented, but in different formats and ways. Broader sets of or broader constituencies are brought on board, and this can be done in a number of ways. You can bring in consultations to a peace process. At the very other end of the spectrum, you even have some public referenda, like in Colombia, where the people even got to vote on the final peace agreement. I would be relatively cautious with that approach, but absolutely, I think it is clear that you need some level of transparency and accountability, particularly towards the end of a process.
Emily, thank you very much indeed. That's Emily Aisaho, who is a programme coordinator for peace mediation at ETH Zurich. Now, still to come on the programme. Pop Mart's Labubus are seemingly attached to everyone's handbags, not mine. Are these new furry and slightly ugly accessories the latest luxury fashion must have? Well, Monocle's Grace Charlton will tell us more. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and we're going to focus on Turkey. And joining us from Istanbul to do that is Monocle's correspondent from that very city, Hannah Lucinda Smith. Good morning to you, Hannah.
Good morning.
Earthquakes, tell us more.
Yeah, of course, something that's on all of our minds constantly, pretty much here in Turkey, and particularly in Istanbul, which of course lies on a major fault line. And that's a fault line which has increasingly been active over the past few months. There's been a series of earthquakes, including here in Istanbul in April, a 6.4, which really rocked the city. It really caused a lot of concern here. But also yesterday, a new series of earthquakes in the city of Balıkesir in western Turkey. Also a few weeks ago, there was a very strong earthquake there, which brought several buildings down. So there is quite a lot of concern here in Turkey that this kind of uptick of seismic activity around Istanbul and its region might be pointing to some kind of bigger earthquake coming down the line.
And are there any contingency plans in place for that?
Well, this is the biggest concern. Of course, everybody knows that this is a seismic region. And back in 2023, as I'm sure you'll remember, we had those devastating earthquakes down in the south. The problem is, no matter how many times this happens, no matter how many warnings come, the building regulations are just never properly applied. There is corruption rife in the construction sector from top to bottom. Political parties like to sort of sling accusations at each other. The fact is, it's every political party, every part of the system. There are bribes, there are payoffs. And here in Istanbul, it really, everybody knows that the city is so crowded. There are so few open spaces. People wonder about, where we're going to muster if this big earthquake comes, how people are going to get evacuated, how emergency teams are going to get in. There's very, very little sort of large scale planning been put into action.
Let's look at aviation, because there was a flight that made an emergency landing yesterday, just 8 minutes after takeoff. What's the detail on that?
Yeah, a quite terrifying story. This was a Fly-Nas flight. This is a sort of Saudi budget airline going from the city of Trabzon, which is on the Black Sea coast, to Jeddah. Now, the plane took off yesterday evening. After 8 minutes after takeoff, it then had to make an emergency stop. The transport minister said that it was a problem with the engines. I have to say, none of the passengers or crew were injured, so a very, very lucky escape there. But we're waiting to find out more about what exactly went wrong with this flight.
Lots of people injured, though, in the latest round of football violence.
Absolutely. So again, last night, this was a match between Kayserispor and Galatasaray. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Galatasaray, of course, they're one of the giants of Istanbul. Kayserispor is a club from central Anatolia. Both of them play in the Turkish Super League. That's the equivalent to the Premier League. And the season's just kicked off here as it has in the UK. We're into the third week and already a major outbreak of violence. We saw Kayserispor fans attacking not only the hotel where Galatasaray fans were staying, also their bus. Looking at the kind of pictures that are coming out, really, really large-scale violence. And I have to say, this isn't a one-off. Increasingly over the past couple of years, there have been incidents like this, both inside and outside the stadiums. And Turks are really wondering why, because quite a sort of firm system was put in place about a decade ago. It's called the Pass League. It was meant to crack down on hooliganism. So now you can't just kind of buy a ticket and rock up at a game. You have to get like a permission card before you do, and all your background is checked out. So people are wondering, how are people managing to slip through this system?
And is it sort of politically based? Do the teams have different ideals? Yeah,
I mean, occasionally. I'll give you an example of a match a few months ago between Elazığspor and Diyarbakırspor. So Elazığ is a city in the east. It's actually quite a mixed city, but it's a very, very strong stronghold for President Erdogan's party and also for sort of nationalist parties. And Diyarbakır is the main Kurdish city. So political tensions there. And the match just couldn't go ahead. I mean, the fans were just throwing projectiles at the players, and the players, were telling their own fans, please stop, we just want to play. So yeah, really, I think part of it is a symptom of these kind of political tensions spilling over onto the pitch.
Now, of course, Turkey, like most of Europe, is in the grip of a long, hot summer, and that's sparking forest fires, but also drought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that really Turks are experiencing more and more every summer. We're right here in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the middle of the area that's most affected by the rising temperatures in Europe. And the drought's been a creeping problem here in Turkey for several years. I remember about 5 years ago, I went to see some farmers in Inner Anatolia who were basically saying, we're on the verge of giving up because we just can't grow crops anymore. And now this kind of this crisis is also reaching the cities. Several of the dams around Istanbul, around Izmir, around the big metropolises are nearly empty. And in fact, in Tekirdağ, which is a city in western Turkey, for several days, they just lost mains water. So this is really something that's it's becoming more and more intense year by year. Also, forest fires, they're popping up pretty much every day. Rising temperatures, there's some accusations of sabotage as well. But clearly, the biggest underlying problem are these really, really intense temperatures that we're dealing with every year here in Turkey now.
And finally, let's have a look at this story, which is examining widespread illegal betting rings.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story from Agos, which is Turkey's newspaper that serves the Armenian community. It's a weekly newspaper here, and it's one of the few sort of newspapers still doing really quite interesting investigations. They've gone to the Grand Bazaar, which anyone who's been to Istanbul will have visited. It's the kind of classic historic shopping centre, also full of gold shops, gold traders, things like that. And what they found is that there are illegal betting rings operating inside the Grand Bazaar. They've spoken to several young men, none of whom wanted to be named, talking about how they're organising themselves into these betting rings. Gambling is illegal in Turkey officially, but I have to say, it seems like almost everybody does it. It seems to be far more popular here than I've ever seen it be in the UK, and particularly with the gambling apps. There has recently been something we cracked down, started by the government, particularly targeting not only the apps, but also money transfer companies. So there's a company called Papara, which is the local equivalent of something like Wise or Revolut. It's a borderless bank. And they were slapped with huge fines for enabling this. But I think a really, really sort of interesting insight there into how it's operating on kind of street level.
Thank you very much. That's Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli strikes hit the Yemeni capital Sana'a on Sunday in retaliation for Houthi missiles fired towards Israel. A Houthi health official says the attack killed 6 people and wounded 86. Meanwhile, Israeli planes and tanks pounded the eastern and northern outskirts of Gaza City overnight Saturday to Sunday, destroying buildings and homes, residents said, as Israeli leaders vowed to press on with a planned offensive on the city. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday that he backed Ukraine's calls for robust security guarantees as part of any peace deal, saying Canada would not rule out sending troops under such a framework. Carney, making his first visit to Ukraine since taking office in March, joined Zelensky for a ceremony in central Kyiv to mark Ukrainian Independence Day. And Chinese property giant Evergrande's shares were taken off the Hong Kong stock market today after more than a decade and a half of trading. It marks a grim milestone for what was once China's biggest real estate firm, with a stock market valuation of more than $50 billion before its spectacular collapse under the weight of the huge debts that had powered its meteoric rise. Evergrande is now best known for its part in a crisis that has for years dragged on the world's second largest economy. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, for a look behind the headlines, here's Monocle's associate culture editor, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, on the bizarre spate of galleries closing down in the United States.
American art galleries are struggling. In the last few weeks, there has been an alarming number of closures, the latest of which, announced last week, is the Tanya Banakta Gallery, which opened on Los Angeles' Highland Avenue in 2018. It joins the 30-year-old Blum Gallery in the Angelino cemetery of recently fallen art dealerships. Meanwhile, Venus over Manhattan and Casmin in New York have both shuttered this summer, as has Clearing, which had locations on the east and west coasts. Some of these closures have come about through retirements and some because their proprietors are starting new ventures. That's the case with Casmin. Nevertheless, these closures are a disquieting signal for an art market that saw global sales fall for the second consecutive year in 2024. It's had a knock-on effect for auction houses too, many of which are pivoting to selling more lucrative luxury goods. The coming months play host to a number of significant art fairs: New York's The Armory Show, Frieze in London and Seoul, and Art Basel Paris, among others. After a summer that's generated gloomy headlines for the commercial art world, let's hope autumn's fairs bring sunnier news.
That was Monocle's associate culture editor, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs. It's 18:31 in Wellington and 8:31 in Zurich. New Zealand Post suspended most shipping services to the United States with no clear timeline for resumption. Only basic letters and express documents remain available. The suspension follows new US tariff measures of 15% that will take effect from August the 29th. Prime Minister Luxon says New Zealand will not retaliate and expects the situation to be resolved soon. Australia Post has also suspended transit shipping to the US. Well, I'm joined now by Geoffrey Miller, geopolitical analyst with the Democracy Project in New Zealand. Geoffrey, many thanks for coming on the show. What's really behind New Zealand Post suddenly stopping most services to the US?
Well, good morning to you, Georgina, in London. Good evening from New Zealand. Look, this really comes about as a result of a wider US policy. It's really the end of an exemption to small consignments, what's known as the de minimis exemption of around $800. And really this is aimed at all those e-commerce shipments coming out of China primarily. That's what Donald Trump's focus is, all these small packages from the likes of Temu, AliExpress, Shein and so forth. Now, that was ended back in May for that exemption for China was ended back in May. What has changed is from this Friday, the 29th of August, the exemption will be ended for all countries worldwide. So postal services around the world are reacting to this because there is no mechanism to collect tariffs. So effectively, New Zealand Post was one of the first services. Many other postal services have followed suit over the weekend, but New Zealand Post has ended the acceptance of parcels bound for the United States. So it's now only possible at the moment to send letters and documents to the United States.
So how much of a hit is this for trade, especially for smaller businesses that rely on US customers?
Indeed, it affects very much small businesses sending small volumes of packages to the United States, direct to consumer businesses, export businesses. There have been reports in the New Zealand media, for example, of a seller of hats, of specialty berets, and sending those to the United States, in particular, with 90% of that firm's customers are apparently based in the United States. And these are very small specialty businesses. They don't typically work through customs agents and brokers. When you look at the big end of town, if you like, in New Zealand's case, that's dairy and meat manufacturers. They have all the usual processes in place. They have import agents, they have customs brokers who handle the payment of the tariffs for them. And New Zealand is subject now to a 15% tariff when sending consignments into the United States. That's been the case since the 1st of August. So, the big guys are okay. They can handle it. I mean, it's still not great for them, the 15% tariff, but they do have a mechanism for passing that on to their customers. There is no mechanism for these direct-to-consumer consignments. It's all been brought in at quite short notice following an executive order that Trump signed back on the 30th of July.
So do you think ordinary New Zealanders will feel this in any noticeable way?
Well, I think certainly small businesses are feeling it because there is no way for them to conduct their business, and their only real option at the moment is to find other markets. And that's, of course, easier said than done. If you've built up a market of consumers in the United States, sending your product in small shipments below that $800 level, you've done probably quite well, developed a market there. Suddenly, overnight, the rug's been pulled out underneath you, and you've got no real alternatives. And this is it's a global problem, and it's certainly not just affecting New Zealand. DHL has also brought this policy in worldwide, and the only consignments it's accepting are under $100 that are clearly gifts from private individuals, and that's based on remarks by the White House that indicate that will remain exempt. So that's probably where we're heading in terms of what will be allowed in the future. But maybe there will be some mechanism established to allow the collection of tariffs for these small consignments. But these processes typically take months to set up. If you're going to set up a website for the US Postal Service or the various country postal operators, goodness knows how it will work. But this has been brought in within a matter of weeks, so it is quite a big deal for those businesses that are affected.
Mm-hmm. And Luxon's government isn't retaliating against US tariffs. Do you think this is smart diplomacy for a small country?
Yes, Christopher Luxon's centre-right government here in New Zealand has very much taken a softly approach to the United States when it comes to tariffs since Liberation Day back in April. It's been very much been working behind the scenes. The Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, the Trade Minister, Todd McClay, they've both been talking with the US counterparts. Todd McClay, the Trade Minister, was up in Washington just last week, making the case to the US Trade Representative. They haven't really made much headway on this. So I'm not sure the softly approach is working. And New Zealand has held back and pulled its punches in other areas to try and please the United States, I think, when it comes to, for example, the recognition of a Palestinian state. New Zealand has been very quiet overall on that. So the time might be right to consider a rethink, but for now, Christopher Luxon is, I think, continuing that approach and hoping that things will be worked out behind the scenes and that some solution will be found. And ultimately, this problem is a global one, and I think a solution of some sort will be found because at the moment, as things stand, it's impossible really to send a parcel to the United States. That seems quite a big shift for the global economy.
No, absolutely. I mean, as you say, New Zealand was the first, but Australia's also pulled US-bound transit mail. How is this affecting the wider region?
Well, indeed, I think when it comes to the likes of New Zealand and Australia, these countries are further away geographically from the United States, and that may explain why they've reacted perhaps as some of the first countries. I think the United Kingdom's rule comes in from tomorrow on Tuesday, and that's just because there are more frequent air services and it was more feasible to get these shipments into the United States before August 29, this deadline on Friday. So you're seeing Australia and New Zealand reacting. I think the broader picture here is that the United States is a big trading partner for both Australia and New Zealand. In New Zealand's case, it's the second biggest export market, second only to China, and it's the third biggest overall trading partner. And very much it's been a success story of the last few years. While New Zealand's trade with China has continued to prosper, so has New Zealand's trade with the United States. And the United States only recently became that second biggest export market for New Zealand. So it does, I think, run the risk. These kinds of things do kind of run the risk of ending that situation where the New Zealand-US trade has prospered. And there's some ironies here, because it was only a few short years ago that New Zealand ministers were encouraging New Zealand exporters to diversify their business away from China. Well, now they're actually saying much the reverse. They're saying, New Zealand exporters need to diversify away from the United States and look for other markets. There are plenty of ironies there.
Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed. That's Jeffrey Miller there. This is Monocle Radio. This summer marks the first since the fall of Syria's longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad, and has brought a surprising revival to the country, the beach holiday. Syrians are now flocking to the coast to enjoy the ocean, many for the first time in their lives. From Damascus, investigative reporter Heidi Pett spoke with Monocle's Hassan Anderson about the phenomenon. Hassan began by asking why trips to the sea had been out of reach for many people in Syria until now.
Syria has been experiencing a civil war for the last 14 years, and there was 60 years of dictatorship before that. And what that meant for everyday Syrians is that they couldn't freely or easily travel across the country. And I'm not just talking about across the front lines that existed between rebel-held areas and regime-held areas in the last 14 years. But even before then, there was this network of checkpoints that the regime put up between different regions of Syria, between different cities, between different neighborhoods. And it got to the point where people did pretty much anything they could to avoid those checkpoints, which were notorious sites of corruption and bribery, but they were also the kind of sites where if you were wanted for conscription into the army, if they suspected that you sympathized with the revolution, if somebody you knew sympathized or participated in the revolution, it meant that you could be picked up and taken off to prison. And the prison system in Syria was, it was a horrible, horrible place. I've visited some of these prisons since the fall of the regime. There's 100,000 people still missing. Thousands of people died under torture. And so for everyday Syrians, if they could avoid crossing these checkpoints, they did. I spoke to one man who he spent 2 years, he didn't even leave his street because there was a checkpoint at the bottom of the hill, at the bottom of his street, and he had deserted from the army. And so he knew if he passed that checkpoint, he would be picked up and he would either be sent to prison or he would be sent back to the army and sent to the front lines. And so when I went to the beach at the height of summer this year, there were so many people who had either never been to the beach before, or they hadn't been in, certainly since the revolution, since things really, really clamped down in Syria after 2011. And so you have this whole country of people who are able to rediscover their own country for the first time in 14 years.
Yeah, and as you say, some Syrians have now been visiting the coast for the first time in their lives, despite having lived in the country for decades. Give us a sense of what Syria's coast is like now in the first summer since Assad fell.
So Syria has a small strip of Mediterranean coastline, in between Turkey and Lebanon. It's quite diverse in terms of geography. You've got some areas of sort of black sand beaches, and then you've got, up in the north, there's these kind of beautiful white cliffs and things like that. And there's a couple of major coastal cities, both of which are sort of industrial. Tartus it's a giant port, there's power generation, there's a big Russian military base there as well still. But in the smaller towns and things like that, you do have a couple of little sort of nascent beach resorts that some of them still function under the regime. There were people who were able to travel, people who lived there, and, some people from Damascus felt safe enough to come back and forth. But it was people from places like Homs and Daraa, the cities that were birthplaces or homes to the revolution, those are the kind of people that didn't dare go to the coast. And so you now see families down there. It's a different way of going to the beach as well, right? Because it's very hot here. And so most of the time, people don't really come down to the seafront until the late afternoon. The heat's gone out of the sun. They'll come down for a swim, or there's also a big culture of these little sort of seaside kiosks and restaurants and cafes where they lay out all of these plastic chairs, either in the sand, or a lot of Syrian cities have what's called a corniche, which is this sort of big promenade or sort of boulevard along the coastline. And people will come down and they'll sit, and they'll look out at the sea, and they smoke shisha, and they're, drinking tea and coffee and things like that. But it's quite a sort of family atmosphere. And then you've got a couple of, these smaller kind of resorts where you'll see young people from Damascus who come up for the weekend, and, they're dancing and partying and drinking beer. And that's where you get more of the kind of, I guess, what you would think of as traditional, like, Mediterranean beach culture, right? Where you've got sun lounges and umbrellas and things like that. But that's quite rare.
It's exciting to hear that. But also, despite this renewed sense of life on the coast for many Syrians, I believe Syria's tourism ministry recently published a set of guidelines at beaches and pools, which include types of clothing that must be worn, specifically burkinis for women and girls covering most of the body. How do locals feel about these rules, and how strongly enforced are they?
Well, the thing about these rules, right, is this has happened a number of times. So back in March, towards the end of Ramadan, an order went around to all of the bars in Damascus that they had to close for Eid. And then there was this big outcry. And within sort of 2 or 3 hours, that order had been reversed. It was like they were sort of testing it out and then went, oh, sorry, we didn't mean it. And the same thing happened with this announcement about appropriate behaviour and attire on the beach, right? It was put out by the tourism ministry. There was a huge outcry from Syrians because Syria is, while it is majority Muslim and quite a conservative society, there are so many different kinds of people in Syria, and there is still, despite everything, most people are kind of pushing for this attitude of tolerance towards each other. And so being told what to do and how to dress by the government didn't go down well. And so again, within, I think it was maybe the same day or the next day, the ministry then issued a correction and said, no, these aren't rules. These are merely guidelines. So it's not necessarily being enforced by the government, but what you are seeing, and I've seen this on the streets of Damascus, I've seen and heard about this in cities like Homs, is you'll get people who may not be part of the government, they may not be part of the kind of security and police forces, but they're sort of freelancing. They've taken it upon themselves to start enforcing these moral codes kind of off their own bat. So you'll have people who are getting on buses and segregating men and women, or people putting up posters and signs in the souks saying that women need to be covered. And same thing, on the beaches and things like that, you'll sometimes have people telling men that they shouldn't be wearing shorts, telling women that they shouldn't be wearing bikinis, but it's not necessarily a government edict.
And just finally, you actually spent some time with a woman who used to write tourist guides for Syria, and she told you that Syria is heaven, but that it needs pure hands to build it again. How likely is it that the hands currently doing that are as pure as they need to be?
It's funny you ask that, because that is exactly what I asked her when she told me that. And she equivocated. She paused. She thought about it and she said, well, it's not just the government. It's the people in the government. As we saw in March, when there was an explosion of violence on the coast in Syria, which is home to, the Alawite community in Syria, which the former president, Bashar al-Assad, and his family were Alawite. And I guess what's crucial here is whether it's that Ahmed al-Shara and the leadership who are trying to paint themselves as moderates capable of administering an inclusive and diverse Syria, whether they are unwilling or unable to tame those excesses by their own security forces. And the real test is going to be whether any of these crimes have consequences, whether the perpetrators are brought to justice. And so until Syrians see real transitional justice for the crimes of the Assad regime, but also for all of the armed groups that participated in the war and these ongoing abuses since the fall, for many Syrians, it's not over yet.
That was Heidi Pett speaking with Monocle's Hassan Anderson. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question. which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialized experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS, banking is our craft.
Well, now let's cross over to Stockholm, where our transport correspondent Gabriel Lee is standing by. Good morning to you, Gabriel.
Good morning.
Tell us about this new Eurowings premium business service.
Yeah, it's an interesting new service that Eurowings is essentially trialing on their longer routes, especially to start with on their Berlin to Dubai route. Now, if you think about these flights are probably 5-6 hours in many cases, and Eurowings, as of now, like many European airlines, on their short haul fleets at least, have a very basic concept of business class. It's basically economy class with a middle seat blocked and better service. Well, Eurowings is trying to see if they can actually sell a proper business class seat, like you might see in domestic US, for example, where you have extra room, more recline, more space, and basically sell it as an upcharge on the sort of higher fares that they would sell anyway. So it's an interesting thing to watch to see if they can make that work, and obviously good news for anybody who's flying on that flight and wanted a little bit more comfort.
Absolutely. Because as you say, I mean, it is kind of ridiculous that we are being sold business class seats, which really are just economy with a tiny bit more room.
It is really, really a terrible thing in most cases. And it's one thing if it's London, Paris, of course, 40-minute flight, you can probably survive. And for the airlines, it's great if they can get away with this. And that's basically what they do, because almost everyone in Europe is doing the same, so they can do it, and it keeps their operation flexible. If you're talking about these longer flights, you have many of the flag carriers of Europe flying 4, 5, 6 hour flights with these aircraft where you're basically, you're experiencing economy class. You just have a tiny bit more space next to you. It's really not great, especially for business travelers. So it would be really great to see this catch on.
Now there's some news from Turkish Airlines.
Right, Turkish Airlines kind of coming in as a wild card to buy a minority stake in Air Europa. That's the number 2 airline in Spain, and it's one of the airlines that's been the source of a lot of speculation about who will buy them or buy part of them, alongside TAP of Portugal. Those are the 2 airlines that are sort of haven't yet been consolidated into the main European airline groups. Now, of course, most people expected that Air Europa the stake would be bought in Air Europa by something like IAG, which runs British Airways, or Air France-KLM, or Lufthansa Group. So Turkish Airlines coming in is kind of a surprise. And another interesting aspect of that is that Turkish Airlines is, of course, Star Alliance, whereas Air Europa is SkyTeam, a rival alliance. So we may see some more alliance shakeups as well.
So could there be a sort of whole leverage effect created through these new partnerships?
What do you mean by leverage exactly?
Well, the deal possibly has the potential to alter revenue streams and perhaps even influence operational diversity.
I think definitely so. I mean, we're seeing more and more consolidation in Europe. For the most part, that has contributed to healthier bottom lines and sort of streamlined services. But you could argue also that as there are fewer and fewer actual owners of airlines in Europe, that's not so great for the customer, for the passenger. Turkish Airlines certainly looking to kind of diversify and leverage this in terms of, they already have a huge network out of Istanbul. This way they can sort of streamline operations using a hub in Madrid and using the fleet of Air Europa and their sort of wider network around places like South America. They fly to some pretty interesting secondary places, even sort of that Turkish Airlines doesn't serve right now.
Finally, let's have a look at Air Canada, because they've committed to covering expenses incurred by passengers stranded during its strike.
Yeah, and this is something really nice to see, actually, and I hope other airlines will take note, because that certainly isn't always the case. If anyone is following the airline industry, or if they had a flight booked on Air Canada in the last couple of weeks, they will have known that this big strike shut down operations for quite a while. That obviously has a huge impact on passengers, especially those that are out, away from home on holiday, that kind of thing. And so Air Canada coming out and saying, look, we're going to cover any reasonable costs of anybody that was affected by this. That's a huge potential expense for them, but it's really a great thing to see in terms of, establishing where they are in terms of, a minimum level of care for their passengers. That shows that they sort of have their hearts in the right place, I would say.
Why isn't that standard practice across the industry?
Well, I think because it's not required generally, and you could sort of point to something like a big strike as something out of the airline's control, right? So airlines will often fight tooth and nail to only cover expenses when it's something that really they cause. So, if it's sort of, there's all these ways they can get around giving the EU 261 compensation, for example, by claiming acts of God or things they couldn't have anticipated. And of course, airlines don't want to spend any more money than they have to. So they're going to be looking to avoid paying for things like this, which, like I mentioned, it will probably be very, very big bill for them.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. That's Monocle's transport correspondent. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally on today's programme, business is booming for Chinese firm PopMart. Their staple products are the fuzzy, ugly but cute doll named the Labubu, which fashion lovers worldwide are attaching to their luxury handbags, whether it's an Hermès Birkin or a Loewe puzzle. The new must-have accessory has become a global phenomenon via social media, and as a result, the brand has seen explosive demand for the figurines, and their profits have soared by nearly 400%. But what is it about the juxtaposition of a sleek bag with an eyesore keychain that's so attractive? Well, earlier, Monocle's associate design and fashion editor Grace Charlton joined Monocle's senior news editor Chris Chermak in the studio to tell us more.
So, Grace, you're going to have to start by explaining this to me as if I were a novice. I do have a picture here of the Labubu doll on my screen, but just tell us about it. What is it?
A Labubu, Labubu, they're these little cutesy bag charms that depict a furry monster with a sort of satanic grin and teeth coming out of it, and maybe they've got bunny ears. There are different types. It's a genius marketing technique.
You went straight for the satanic grin one. I did notice, although there's like 300 different types.
Well, I think they all have a satanic flair to them. I would argue that. Just
by nature of being a very tiny doll, really.
Yeah, it's something in the eyes. There's something about the eyes that don't lie. Like they're so creepy. They come from Hong Kong. They were designed by this artist called Kesing Lung. And they've just blown up in the past year, and they're everywhere. Like, I've been to fashion weeks, and everyone on the front row has a little Labubu creature hanging off their designer handbag. It's the sort of juxtaposition between a really fine piece of craft from Loewe or Hermès, like, blended with this horrific little toy. It's so interesting.
Tell us what you really think, Grace.
I know. I mean, what do you think of them? Are you convinced?
I mean, I really don't know what to make of it. No, it's incredible how many of these things are around. And as I understand, it all started, as everything does tend to these days, by some person, some influencer. In this case, the Thai rapper Lisa started showing her collection of them.
Yep, Rihanna and Cher as well. They're early adopters. But so since they've blown up the Labubu spot, the Lafufus have now flooded the market. They're the fake Labubus.
Oh, that's scary.
You can find them.
So you don't know if you're getting the real one or not.
Exactly. You can find them everywhere, even at the corner shop around from our office, Chris. I don't know if you've been recently.
They're seen,
they're selling Lafufus.
Something like that.
It's mad. It's gone too far. I actually do feel bad for this artist who clearly didn't copyright her design correctly, because it's just being ripped off left, right, and centre.
But this happens all the time. There was the Ronex to the Rolex, or whatever you want to have. Like, this is just inevitable in the world of luxury and fashion, isn't it?
True. And I wrote a piece for the Monocle newsletter, but I sort of said it's ironic when something that's a little bit niche and adopted by a community who want to, have it as a symbol of their own individuality, and then suddenly it becomes a global phenomenon. There's a tinge of Schadenfreude when I see that happen, I'm not going to lie.
Schadenfreude, but what you also wrote about in your Monocle Minute was the fact that this is also being seen as like an opportunity for the fashion industry at this point. Like they kind of need the money at this point right now.
Well, because luxury is in crisis, we've spoken about it a lot on radio, the price of a bag has just increased tenfold. There's no way, it's not an accessible price point anymore in the way that maybe a bag used to be. A Chanel bag, maybe someone could save up for months and buy it, but now they just can't because it's too expensive. So instead, brands like Bottega and Loewe, they're making little bag charms that you can clip onto your, tote bag. You can clip it onto anything, your phone, your belt. And that's the new accessible price point. And I'm sure you know about the lipstick theory. that when in times of recessions, the lipstick sales go up because it represents like a smaller item of luxury that is affordable. I think that's the new bag charm. I'm going to coin the bag charm theory.
The bag charm theory. And it does get tricky, though, at the same time, because I understand always there's this interesting thing in fashion and trends, isn't there, where it's partly about scarcity. It was the fact that these Labubus were quite rare. It's hard to get one for yourself. Is that going to change if all of these other fashion brands now start making their own?
For sure, definitely, especially if there are like cheap rip-offs. Also, a Labubu, we were looking at this earlier, they cost about £150, if not more. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And that's the affordable price point.
We decided we didn't quite have the Monocle budget to bring one into the studio.
I know. We should have gotten a Lafufu from the corner shop. That would have been so cute.
That's a good point. Yes, next time we'll get a Lafufu instead. Well, one other aspect that is fascinating, Grace, you were telling me about earlier today, is there is a conspiracy theory as part of this as well. And I mean, I know we're serious journalists, but that shouldn't necessarily stop us. We've just got to throw it out there. It's all a Chinese conspiracy. This is what some people are saying.
You know, there are two conspiracy theories. I found another one in the time between us talking and coming on air. The first conspiracy theory is that these are little recording devices manufactured by the Chinese government and distributed worldwide. Genius, if so, can I just say that is amazing. The second conspiracy theory is that these little creatures are inspired by a Syrian deity called Pazuzu. And it's not a deity, sorry, it's a demon that brings a curse to the people who interact with it. So all of these little Labubus and Lafufus inspired by Pazuzu are cursed, and they're cursing you, and they're cursing the people around them, and that's maybe why. I mean, I would just like to say that I was really early on against this trend, and I saw it. You know, now it's trendy for people to hate on Labubus. I knew they were bad from the start. There was something about that. My intuition just rejected it very quickly.
Grace, you know there are studies that suggest if you want to dismiss a conspiracy theory, the best way to do it is to dismiss another one. So if you give people one conspiracy theory, then they'll believe you when you say that the other one is not true.
So which one's not true?
So which one of these should we say is not true?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I don't want to put I don't want to put it out there in the world. I hope it's the Chinese spying device. I hope that's not true.
Just finally, Grace, what's the next fad you're expecting on your in your predictions, good or bad?
I think the next fad, and I'm on board for this one, is just a little bit of lace peeping out from under a jumper. I mean, we're going to see it everywhere this autumn, and it's inspired by Chloe, the brand that's sort of bringing boho chic back. And literally, I was walking down Chiltern Street earlier, and I saw 5 girls wearing just a little bit of lace peeping out from a jumper.
I've actually just been in Belgium this weekend. Maybe I need to pick up a little bit of lace to join this trend.
Yeah, can you bring me back some lace?
Will do.
Grace Charlton and Chris Chermack, and that's all we have time for today. Thanks to producers Hassan Anderson, Chris Chermack and Monica Lillis, our researcher Henry King and our studio manager Lily Austin. There's the briefing on the way at midday. The headlines are coming up, and of course the Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.